Cool. Hi, everyone. You're listening to The Blockchain Socialists. And for today's interview, I have Paul Seidler, who is one of the co-founders of the Terra0 collective, which is a really interesting project that started, I think, back in 2016. That had a very, very forward-thinking look on kind of the potential relationships between, let's say, blockchain technologies, automation, and nature. And so maybe before I try to explain what Terra0 is, maybe Paul, would you like to introduce yourself and maybe regale us with the story of Terra0 and how it came about? Because I think it's a pretty interesting one.
Sure. So my name is Paul Seidler. I'm an artist and researcher. I will go a little bit into the kind of origin story of Terra0 and tell some deep Terra0 lore. And then sort of go a little bit on like how we're developing this project at the moment. So we met. So Terra0 is essentially a group of 3 people in the beginning. We met at the University of Arts in Berlin and were interested in the possibilities of smart contracts, specifically the administration of capital and how they could almost like autonomously manage capital in certain ways. At this point, the smart contracts were pretty much not used that much, so they were kind of a novel technology, and they were related like conceptually to the idea of autonomous agents. These were essentially or this was a concept that if a computer program can administer capital, it could essentially autonomously make decisions and, for example, become an economic actor. This was almost like, I think the concept of autonomous agents actually were like almost like pre-Ethereum. So it wasn't like wasn't something like Ethereum specific, but something which I think was almost like developed before. There are early like writings from Vitalik on DAOs and on decentralized autonomous corporations and also autonomous agents, which were also these groups of organizational models for smart contracts. And we were interested in these kind of various models which were outlined at the time, and we're questioning also what could we do with this? Like, could we basically use these ideas of autonomous agents or of DAOs to encapsulate ecological systems and sort of give agency to ecological systems in specific ways and form or reform like relations between actors, so humans and sort of non-humans, which are like plants or animals and these things. There is a science fiction author which I just want to mention because this is like sort of funny lore, who's called like Karl Schröder, and he wrote like a first novel in I think 2014 or something, which is called like Deodans, and this is about a national park which is owned by animals. So kind of a national park which is like owned by like almost like a KI system, which then is like connected to animals, and they sort of have like governance. They have like non-human augmented governance for this kind of like nature preservation
awesome.
park, which which is kind of like an easy sort of like pitch. So I think one of the earliest ideas of Terra0 were really like imagine like an intelligent self-driving car, but it's not a car, it's a forest.
Right.
That's kind of like
Right.
that's kind of like the easiest sort of pitch, I would
Yeah,
say.
it reminds me of kind of I don't know if you know the book. What came to mind to me was Demon or Damon by Daniel Suarez.
Oh yeah.
I feel like that book, which I think it was in the 90s, maybe like late 90s it came out, or early 2000 or something like that. But that explored a lot this idea of like autonomous agents, more in a dystopian way. But yeah, the I think the imagination can go into wild places when you think about autonomous agents and what they could potentially do. But what is interesting about Terra0, of course, is that it's flipping it flips the script a little bit in that it's thinking about, yeah, how do we give autonomy to the types of things that don't normally have autonomy, and that have like very high consequences, like animals and nature, of course.
Yeah, no, to the Daniel Souza's kind of question or like notion, Yeah, it's interesting that like I think this also directly influenced like Vitalik's
Yeah,
writing
he
on
mentioned it. Yeah, yeah. Before.
so I think we have there this case of like really like hyperstition in a sense where like science fiction is really literally like influencing people who are like building like technology, which is something funny or something worse.
Funny or terrifying? I'm always swaying back and forth.
Yeah, probably both in a sense.
Yeah, I think.
I mean, it's also funny, like if like Seuss wrote this as sort of like a critique, right? And then someone is like, "Oh, that's actually kind of cool. Let's do it."
Yeah,
So
that's what I
yeah,
always. Yeah, I mean that's too much of a rabbit hole. That's like a consistent thing that I find with some, say, crypto libertarians or techno libertarians, which you want to call it. Like, wow, look at this dystopian sci-fi book. Let's do that.
yeah. There's this whole like story of like how people probably misread like cyberpunk in a sense, but yeah, let's let's maybe not get into this.
Yeah, let's stay positive for this episode, maybe. But so yeah, so Terra0 was interested in sort of exploring this potential to giving autonomy uh, to natural things or non-human entities. Um, so maybe to start off, would you want to talk a bit about some of the uh, art installments that you guys have made to sort of explore this idea?
Sure. Maybe I can also talk a little bit about the first like white paper we wrote in 2016 because it gives like a easy to understand like narrative. So like in the first white paper, we were almost like interested in using this like sort of narrative of classical liberalism. So basically like the idea of like, okay, like you have generation of values through work, you have resource extraction, and basically like using this almost like methodology, and like subverting it a little bit. In concrete, this was meaning that our first proposal would work as the following, right? We have like a forest, which is sort of governed by like a program, and this can be sort of any sort of program, which then collects data. This can be through like satellite data or through some sort of on the ground work. It can be any sort of sensible data. And based on this data, the program would actually mint like wood tokens. So it would sort of like calculate, okay, I can like get rid of these and these trees, um, and then would calculate like tokens. And these wood tokens would then be sold like on the market. So people could then go into the forest and sort of like acquire the wood. And with this, like really, this is like a really simple like procedure, right? This is essentially what every like company which is selling, or which is like a lumber company is doing. So, but basically, this acquired money, which would be like could be like autonomously acquired, would then be used for the program to essentially buy the whole land itself. So in the end, you would have then this almost like complex of like an automated system, which also owns like land because it can, to a certain point, administer capital. And in this scenario, this almost like forest hybrid becomes like a shareholder of itself. I mean, there are obviously a lot of flaws with the system, like technically and conceptual, but I think it shows that there are like already actors in all the kind of like systems we engage with who are like not completely defined by human decisions. And I think this is something which is like not super novel. I mean, it sounds pretty like science fiction, but if you think of these in like the systems we're like embedded in, you have, for example, like corporations, which are sort of, as Charles Stross was like mentions, like kind of almost like a slow AI form, right? They're kind of like they're kind of like processes in which a lot of people like communicate with each other and sort of fill decisions, but like no one, I mean, like technically, no one is like in control completely of the whole thing, right? It's kind of like a emergence through like different processes and different like protocols, and they be like in corporations, they're like social, but I mean, obviously, they can be also like automated to a sense. So I think this notion of that there are already these kind of weird like organizational forms can really lead to interesting experiments. And with the emergence of DAOs, we now have the ability to actually like test them in more like decentralized ways.
Right. Yeah. I've sometimes I've read before of someone kind of describing capital as an AI. That's just kind of like always on the mission of accumulating more of itself. And so people are kind of like almost infected by this AI. They have almost like a virus, and they sort of like do its will to sort of like, yeah, just to promote more and more accumulation. I think it's a pretty wild idea. Um, but yeah, I think on your website you kind of describe it like exploring like a cybernetic forest, I think is what you guys say, which is really interesting.
Yes.
So kind of like which I think, yeah, as you mentioned, anyways, it may sound crazy, but already corporations, they need this information in order to maximize like what their goals are, which is to, accumulate profits or accumulate capital or whatever else. So to imagine that we instead just kind of like take the portions of the collection of this data, and then like deciding to choose a very different type of algorithm to apply that data to, that has a different sort of logic embedded in it, not one that's based on capital, but one based on maybe like, yeah, the regeneration or the upkeep of this particular natural space, is like a very interesting one to think about. And we can get into it later, but like I think is the direction that is more interesting to me than maybe like some refi projects that I've read.
Yeah, I think in the first in this first white paper, or in this first idea, we were also criticized like heavily for, and I totally agree that this is a total valid critique, that like essentially this is just using a kind of logic of extraction to a different mean, or to a different end in a sense, right? And I do agree that this is like a total like a weird thing. It's kind of like almost like subverting the logic with the logic itself, which is like as an art project sort of funny or like interesting. But when you then like think this through as like, okay, how would this actually look as a living system? It's not that there is not that much of a liberatory or kind of like a liberational aspect to it, right? It kind of like does essentially, or I mean, it depends, but like it can fall like in this niche that it does essentially what any other corporation also is doing, which is like accumulating capital, or kind of like these things. So this is also why we're at the moment like really in the process, or we started to like rewrite essentially our first like white paper a little bit, because as an art project, we were in the situation that we never had in the beginning like enough sort of like means to do this project on a large scale. So we essentially chopped up a lot of ideas we had in this white paper in like smaller experiments, which we then could do like in art institutions, in sort of, yeah, as small experiments, as small installations, as small sculptures. And yeah, through like this iteration of these different sculptures, or these different small projects, we learned and experimented with, yeah, different times, different value creations, and different like ways in which like care and, yeah, care is essentially happening. And all of these things led a little bit to us kind of rewriting and like rethinking all of this initial thoughts of the paper.
Nice. Do you want to go through maybe a couple of these art installments and how that shifted your thinking from the
Yes,
white paper?
yes. Let's maybe go through this, or go through some of them. So like one of the earliest was essentially like Flowertokens. And Flowertokens was an experimental project which was centered around the tokenization and verification, we called it, of natural commodities, and was the first sort of attempt to create almost like crypto-collectible, which is linked to sort of a physical asset. What we did is we built like a installation in a semi-public space in Trust in Berlin. Trust is, by the way, a co-working
Right.
space. Maybe you should also talk to them at one
No,
point.
I've tried to
They're-
ask Arthur to come on before, but he says he's too shy.
well, I know.
But I'm a big fan of them, and I'm a paying member for their Discord.
So okay, I have done my duty. I've done some like trust advertising. So I'm back to it. So we basically did like the installation in Trust, which was a kind of rack in which 100 flowers, which were dahlias, were kind of positioned all were kind of like standing. So you had like 100 flowers in a rack. And these flowers were essentially filmed by like a camera and have like a computer vision system attached, which would like use the collected data and attach it to like the metadata of an NFT. So basically, you would have for every flower, you would have like one NFT, which would have like changing metadata. This was done in 2018, and yeah, there was not that much NFTs back then, and also like the protocol was kind of like, I mean, NFTs were defined, but it was not 100% clear, for example, how OpenSea is parsing the metadata and things like everything was still like a little bit more in flux, and there were no like NFT hypes yet. But people like bought them, and we found out something kind of interesting because we had also like a market site implemented on our page, so people could like trade them also on our website. And we found out that actually barely people traded them because people had like kind of personal relations to their flowers. So they were like pretty much, we in the beginning thought, okay, this will just be like almost like commodity thing and people will like flip them and stuff. But that didn't happen that much. Like I think there were barely any people who sold like theirs for like reasonable prices. So people really create.
Were there people who wanted to buy them?
Yeah, there were actually people, but like there were not that much sold because people would like either like price theirs for like insane amount of like ETH, like I don't know, like 100 ETH, and then obviously like no one would buy this, or like people would not sell them that much, which I think is due to that.
An inefficient market, perhaps.
Yeah, yeah, it's definitely an infinite market. But yeah, I also think it says something about sort of tokenizing sort of like living organisms,
Right,
and
right.
that like if there is a sort of bound between these things, there are things which work beyond sort of being just like a commodity. Um, and the other thing we kind of uh, learned from this, or we kind of saw, is that a lot of people were actually interested in like watering the flowers or doing something, going there, and like so like also like people were then, hey, how much are they how often are they watered, can we change this? So even if we didn't had anticipated that this would be about governance, it also became then sort of a little bit about governance, insofar as that people are like, okay, like what are the parameters of these systems? Can we change these parameters and things like this, which we all hadn't like at all thought about. So this was maybe kind of an interesting two interesting things. And also obviously we learned that we are like terrible gardeners or whatever you want to call this, because they grew essentially like way out of the rack. So this rack was like, in the end, it looked like a
Oh, wow.
jungle. And like even like the technical system, so basically like the kind of camera which would then, and the computer program which would then like crop essentially the image, wouldn't work that good anymore because they were so much jungly that like it couldn't like
Yeah.
determine like the height anymore. So a classical example of sort of like a sort of like plant system, which you like sort of plan, and you have like your modernist approach to this, right? You're like, okay, we can all calculate this, and they're not going to be bigger than this and this, and then like obviously none of this happens. Obviously they get bigger, obviously the computer vision system doesn't. And but this shows also something interesting. I mean, I think like a lot of the practice of Terra0 is probably like failing. And, but like this failing procedure is also really important because it like teaches us, or teaches also the people who are like contributing to this, um, a lot about like emergent behavior of these systems.
I mean, I would say it's probably a good thing that you guys are failing this, failing in the arts world rather than like, I don't know, someone trying to implement it at a mass scale. So I think they're like really important experimentations. One of the things that came to mind when you're talking about like people not wanting to sell their tokens because they care about the flowers because they have like a personal attachment, like um, you have this, I can't remember exactly the terms, but there's like, generally agree like three different types of kind of like ways you can divide up property ownership. There's like, usus, which is like being able to use something. There's like being able to profit off of something. And there's a third one that I'm forgetting. But David Graeber, I'm forgetting which book it was, but he said that there's actually like a fourth thing, which was like the ability to care for something as like a potential thing. And so I imagine that like this is almost similar to me, like when people buy pets. Like usually when we talk about
Yeah,
like buying commodities, you're always open to your commodity being sold at a higher price, but people like they spend money to care for an animal, like for a pet, and they don't want to give it away like for more money necessarily. Like usually most people don't do that. And I imagine it's similar with the flower tokens where ironically, people want to pay money to have the responsibility to care for something, which is like, that's not a very tradable good.
yeah. It pretty much is like not super explainable with like a classic economic
Right,
framework, I
right.
think. Because there, yeah,
Yeah, there's no sense of care in classical economics or classical
yeah,
liberalism,
or like really,
which is because it's very
really,
it goes kind of against the Homo economicus, I guess. That like why in the world are you spending money to like care for a little flower or like care for your dog or whatever who probably doesn't can't like I don't know, help you find food or something like that. At this point dogs can't. Like you do it because you want to care for it and you want like the kind of softer mushy stuff that you get out of it than you do out of like I don't know, buying a Game Boy or something.
yeah, no, totally. Good point with the grabber. If you find the reference, would be also interested
Yeah, I'd have to find it again.
which which, which book it
Yeah.
was. But yeah.
Would you want to talk about maybe like the current status? You've mentioned a little bit that you guys are rewriting the white paper based on the sort of like learnings of some of these art installments. You want to talk a little bit about like the status of that and how do you see the project moving forward?
Yes. So last year, we were approached by LIS, which is called like Light Art Space, and that's an art organization, a foundation, which approached us and were interested in working together with us because they knew some other or they knew some like previous iterations of the project and they were sort of interested in offering support. And we are at the point where we think it makes sense to really think through the first like white paper again and look at the technology which is there at the moment and look at sort of what we wanted to do in the beginning and what we wanted to do now after sort of these experiments and really create almost like a Terra0 land art project, basically like you could also call it almost like a crypto land art piece. Um, and this would be really like what would it take to actually like manage a forest, like a proper forest by like a DAO, and also what basically like what resources would this need, but also like what different sort of voting or like governance framework this would need or would have to set in place there. And yeah, with LIS, we got sort of like a cultural partner who was really interested in supporting this at a larger scale. And this gave us like time to revisit it, our original paper, and think how we could transform it into which is something which is still interesting for us, but also like actually buildable or actually kind of like implementable on like a scale of a land art project. And that means we scraped a lot of the automation part, of the AI part. I think I talked a little bit about this um, out of our concepts and thought of this more in processes which actually can be done by humans or can be done by communities and by people who want to participate in this in sort of like meaningful ways. I think I would go not too much into the detail of like how we would manage this, but just in general that we're shifting the focus from like automation towards governance, and that this will help us also to think of the project almost not in a super like theological sense that we know where this is going, right? This has like an end direction and like then you have this full autonomous forest, but rather in like a gradual sort of like community oriented way in which we could first think of like a forest, a piece of land which is connected to like a legal body, and this legal body is essentially managed by a DAO, or is essentially, yeah, we're talking at the moment with lawyers, and we're like pretty happy that we might be able to actually map a DAO into like a German form of like a Verein. And a Verein is something like um, it's not directly like a foundation, but something like a little bit similar. It's more like a club thing, but there is no like complete equivalent in like yeah, in the yeah, it's kind of like an association, I would say, but it's and but we are now at the point where I think it would be possible to essentially map like a DAO, which has like, for example, ERC20 tokens onto like this legal structure, and like defined like members by like token by yeah, by the token holders or by like the addresses, which means we can essentially, if this all works out, we can define members by addresses and don't have to do like some sort of like know your customer policy or something. So that would be pretty cool, because then we could have essentially like this association which has like all of these members, but like most of them could stay like anonymous, or most of them could stay like without registering with us, which I think is something pretty interesting or pretty cool. So you would basically have then this like mixture of like a legal body and a DAO. This would be probably like also like a Gnosis multisig, like extended with some sort of governance structure. Like they have like a governor mod now, which in which it will be able to do like on-chain proposals and on-chain voting pretty good. Like, and Gnosis chain is also pretty nice because it's like really low transaction costs. So that's something which we also look forward to. Um, but basically, yeah, then having this like technological structure, essentially managing and having holding essentially a piece of forest, and then doing also mostly in the beginning like sort of regenerative practices on it, like replanting and kind of doing things which make the biodiversity, or like increase the biodiversity of the actual piece of land. So this is where we want to sort of strive towards to, but with sort of still the kind of longer term goal of in the process, like more and more getting people as responsible sort of, or as failure points a little bit like out, and see like what kind of things need to be done by people, but what could also be done by like automated systems, and also what could in longer term, what kind of like, and this might be also interesting, like legal subjects or like new legal subjects could arise of this. So we still think it's like worth no kind of like, we're thinking about what new legal forms would arise if like ecosystems would grant it also legal rights.
Right. Yeah. Interesting. To me, this kind of like relates to this question that I guess I've been mulling over a bit, of like how, I mean, as it exists right now, the system kind of treats nature as kind of like an externality, as like something that is outside of its scope, I guess. And so whatever happens in that realm is sort of forgotten about. There's not much tracking, I guess, of what happens. So yeah, I think probably if we want to do like serious types of climate action, I think, or to embed sort of climate action into the system, it's sort of like a requirement to consider like its place in the system and where it fits. And yeah, my hope is that that can happen in a way that doesn't sort of at the same time subjugate it in certain ways.
Yeah, no, I totally agree. I think we have also a quite different approach to a lot of these like bigger projects which try to do this on like more like massive scale, because we think more of a way of this in becoming bottom up, right? So starting with like a small thing and then like going up and see how this can be managed, rather than sort of like imposing like a superstructure on a lot of different like territories, or on a lot of different sort of like local environments, and then sort of pretending that there is like a one fit for all solution, which I don't think there is, to be honest. I think that this all needs to be, if they need to be sort of like, as you said, like effective like climate action, this needs to be something which can't be like a one fit for all model.
Right. Yeah. I mean, what I like about the Terra0 project generally is, of course, like this, like the art pieces and what you guys do is always rooted in land of like the specific locality in which you guys are doing your pieces, which is like definitely like the opposite of most things that crypto people do, in that people are generally interested in crypto as kind of like a transnational type of thing that is sort of that we are, we have been released from our corporeal bodies and we are just purely digital beings now through the blockchain and can sort of get around any of these limitations. I think is a little bit, I think it's very short-sighted. And it's something that, I think with crypto generally as well, what's also different about with a lot of maybe crypto things that people are interested in is sort of subverting legal systems and sort of getting around legal systems rather than trying to improve it or change it in some way usually. But yeah, I guess based on your experience of working, in relation to land and with crypto and art and blockchains, do you have any like thoughts or suggestions? You kind of, I guess you mentioned it a little bit with not sort of like imposing, but do you have any advice for how to approach it?
Yeah, I think you made a really interesting point with this strange like division of sort of the eternal body, which is like which is now sort of like uploaded in the digital realm. And I think like a lot of crypto suffers from this idea that almost like the net, or like this early idea of cyberspace as almost like a no man's land, right? Of this sort of like terra nullius in a sense, which kind of on a more deeper level sort of misses this, for me, like materialistic perspective on sort of technology as infrastructure. And there is this almost like Cartesian duality between like a digital and a physical realm. And I don't think the separation doesn't make that much sense anymore. I don't think you can like think of technology without thinking about like the infrastructure. You can't think about like software without thinking about the hardware, right? You can't think about like all the infrastructure which is behind and all the kind of production processes which went into these technologies. So and I think like a lot of the approaches we see from crypto towards land and this kind of idea of creating like new states or creating like
is that a network state reference?
Like a network state thing. So I mean, I think like to come to this point where you're like, okay, we can actually make a network state, you have to sort of live in this or have both of these things, right? You have to, like, on the one side be convinced that there is a strong separation between the material and like the digital world, which I think is like a fallacy. And you also sort of have to ignore the material conditions of the production and this itself, and then you're essentially proposing some sort of transcendent imaginary superstructure onto like sort of something which just happens, right? Like an immanent sort of like people live there for like a long time. There is like history, there are like shared like stories, like, and then you come and be like, oh no, but we come like from the digital realm and we can now
we are gods descending from the digital realm to help you.
Yeah. I mean, this is also really Platonic. I think there is a reason why a lot of this like shares like fascination with, like, for example, Greek like beauty standards and stuff like this. I do think all of this. I do think all of this is essentially like Platonic in a sense that they're like, oh, we have this like immortal forms and they can be now like brought down onto the earth. Right? And I think like it's really like, in a sense, like not, or like pre-modern like conceptions of philosophy, of identity, of like ideas. It's all like pretty like pre-modern, but it's sort of like proposes that this like digital realm, as you said, is sort of this eternal abstract like realm where in reality is like pretty connected to like all the processes we live around.
Right. Yeah. That makes me like, I start to realize now, like a lot of like vaporwave type of aesthetic stuff always has like, those like Greek statues and stuff like that.
Yeah.
Yeah, definitely there's something to that.
On the other side, maybe to the question of how to approach like this mixture of legal, or basically this kind of intersection between like law, state law, and crypto. This is something where we're working on this intersection quite for some time, and it's actually not super easy. It's quite like hard to do there, even basic things. We did for the Carnegie International Festival last year. We did an art piece which was called "A Tree, a Corporation, a Person," and this was basically kind of a legal body which was a 501c4, which is kind of like a legal body which is normally used for lobbying in the US. And we sort of like formed this body, and this body was like leasing a piece of land on which a tree was planted. And this legal body should then be like controlled by like a smart contract, and managed through a smart contract eventually to then also essentially become a new sort of legal person, in a way, like later in sort of like the process. But like even getting to the point where you can manage like a kind of property by like a smart contract, even through something like a legal body, is like pretty hard. It's like not something just like completely
Yeah.
solved. So we were like in sort of like rooms with like, I don't know, or in calls with like 6 lawyers from like different institutions, and all of these are like not solved problems. So yeah, I think when we talk about this intersection, there's like pretty little done sort of in the real world, right? I think it's super easy to write about like, oh yeah, we're gonna go to some country where there is no jurisdiction and sort of build something there, or try to build something there. But like actually doing it and like trying to work through the law and like communicate with these people, and is much more like yeah, it's much harder to do this, and to sort of yeah, try to make these things happen.
But I think maybe part of the reason why crypto people try to avoid that a lot of the time is because they don't want to do the hard the hard work of like having to deal with the legal system, maybe partially.
Yeah, I wonder, because yeah, I do think there are like huge like opportunities in actually working through the systems and thinking of how you can make like a, I don't know, like a corporation more like a DAO, to make it more even like on a pure level of like economics, to make it more feasible to like found these, or like
Right.
also like make like workers shareholders and stuff
Use
like that.
DAOs as a Trojan horse to force like worker ownership, more worker ownership in
Yes.
corporations. That's what people should be doing.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Hi, everyone. If you're enjoying this episode so far, be sure to subscribe, leave a review, share with a friend, and join the crypto leftists communities on Discord or Reddit, which you can find links to in the show notes. If you're enjoying the episode or find the content I make important, you can pitch into my efforts starting at $3 a month on patreon.com/theblockchainsocialist to help me out. As a patron, you'll get a shout out on an episode and access the bonus content like Q&A episodes, which you can submit and vote on questions you'd like me to answer, and I'll give my thoughts in roughly 20 minutes. In the last bonus episode, I analyzed applying an anti-capture framework made for DAOs and applying them instead to left-wing organizing, keeping in mind the specific challenges that they face. Of course, I'll still be making free content like this interview to help spread the message that blockchain does not need to be used to further entrench capitalist exploitation if we put our efforts into it. So if that message resonates with you, I hope you'll consider helping out. Also, in case you didn't see it yet, I recently wrote a book review for Outland magazine on, no surprise, the network state, focused on Balaji's misunderstanding of the role of land and statecraft and his insistence to think of everything as a code base, titled Fork Your Society, I Want Out. Additionally, I've written the piece under my real name, so I am now officially doxxed. I can officially stop bleeping out whenever someone says Josh, my name, during interviews now. It was time I came out of the Anon closet, since this is all in preparation for an announcement for a book that I've been writing for over the past year and a half titled Blockchain Radicals. But more on that later. For now, let's get back to the interview. It's funny that, I assume the with the art pieces kind of a play on like how corporations are seen as basically like humans in the United States and things like that?
Yes, we are pretty much interested in, or this was one of the earliest Terra0 research themes, is in a sense how like personhood is constructed, how legal personhood is constructed, how natural personhood is constructed, and also like obviously what is not granted personhood. And it's kind of like a really sort of interesting history how this is always like also instrument of sort of the state to determine who can do what, right? And who can say what. So this is almost like always like a power relation in a sense, which is expressed through this.
So from 2016 and only till like fairly recently, I feel like Terra0 was probably one of the only like kind of like nature related crypto projects that I had really been aware of until the great explosion of refi projects that have sprung up the past year or two. But I have some definitely spicy thoughts on refi. But I'm curious what your thoughts on there, having maybe been like you're kind of like the hipster who was like, oh, I was here first, exploring this space before you guys. But yeah, do you think there is like kind of this relation between, I guess, what is happening with refi now and with Terra0? I would just say, like, just for myself, one of the things that has bothered me, and I imagine many others about the refi space, is that there is kind of like this mixing of nature with finance. So it can often come off for a lot of people as kind of like this financialization of nature, and where the solution that's being proposed is sort of like financializing more of nature. And this is seen by, I think, a lot of people who are maybe like active like climate activists, or like people who are deeply involved in sort of like the climate movement, find deeply unserious that financial that relying on carbon credits, which is a lot of refi. And I know a lot of people have intentions of moving beyond carbon credits and refi, but a lot of the things that I see proposed, I sometimes have a something goes off in my head, and I'm like, that doesn't sound right. But yeah, I'm curious what you think.
Yeah, I will not be giving my most spicy takes on refi, but you're right. I think it's kind of like the "I was here before" thing. maybe, maybe that's right. For me, like one of the basic assumptions, which I think you talked also a little bit, is sort of like the following, which is kind of like more markets can solve market inherently problems.
Right. It's like leaning more into markets whenever markets are kind
Yeah,
of
it's
part of a big part of the problem.
Yeah, it's kind of like almost like digging deeper into the thing, right? It's kind of like you dug this hole and you're like, how do I come out of this hole? And you're like, oh, let's just dig deeper. And I think sometimes this could work in a sort of sense, but like also like one of the basic assumptions is never kind of questioned. So it's never questioned like how are these markets like created historically? Like what history do these markets actually have? What purpose do they solve outside out of blockchain? And I think this is also like inherently not like crypto spirited in a sense. If you would be like saying, okay, crypto is really like a thing or a question of how like even basic things are like organized, you would say that like a lot of the verification models and a lot of the models of how CO2 credits are created, or how are these accounting systems for nature are created, are like purely centralized. They're like done by like big sort of environmental agencies. They're done by, I don't know, like Vera, which is this like, what is it called, like voluntary carbon credit standards. They're like, so like none of this is in any how like connected to like basically the ideas of crypto for me, which is kind of like eliminating middlemen, having trustless verifiable like kind of processes, because all of these things are just like centralized entities which act pretty much outside of like the cryptosphere. And now if we like just take these like, I don't know, verifications or processes and just put them on chain, for me that's not like, that doesn't solve anything. That's just like a kind of adapting like bad practices and like porting them to crypto in a sense. So I don't know. From yeah, for me, like there are like more hard questions to solve. And this is basically how decentralized verification of biodiversity can happen, how metrics of this type of data can be decided scientifically on, and how this can be done transparently. And I do think we have like the technology to like build this. I just think like no one is like doing the hard work of like applying these like properly in like contexts which are like not reliant on, I would say, like trad CO2 structures or something like the trad CO2 market. Yeah.
Trad CO2. One of the things that I think they are perhaps trying to do, that I basically mentioned before, that I am interested in thinking about, is kind of like through the financialization of nature, that would then become no longer an externality, because financial markets would have to consider. Of course, I think it's pretty dubious a bit, like what type of impact that can have. I'm not fully convinced on a lot of that stuff. But I think in comparison to Terra0, just to make this, that you guys use this language that you mentioned of kind of allowing a forest to become a shareholder of itself, which, this could be seen in some ways like it's not financialization per se of how people think about financialization, but it is kind of like the I don't know, like putting business logic, like by saying shareholder, I guess, just that term, in the context of nature, which is also maybe a bit strange for people.
Yeah, I mean, for me, there is a general problem with the term nature, how it's like perceived today, or how it's kind of like sort of today, as it's like, because when you think of it, it's something you always search, but like you never find. Like it's really hard to see where like nature is actually like located on, like in like the physical space, for example, right? Like like is it something which is like untouched by humans, but then it's like barely anywhere anymore? Like if you like talk about nature of this sort of like pristine, sort of untouched like forest, untouched like then like then there is no nature in Europe anymore. Like this is like basically everything which is around us at the moment is like cultural landscape. Like there is in, I'm pretty sure like in Germany there is no like untouched forest. There's nothing which is like not inherently formed by society and the production sort of which take place in like society and the sort of like mode of production. So yeah, I have like a little bit of problem with this term of nature, because it's pretty hard to distinguish what is nature and what is not nature in a sense. Yeah.
Yeah, that's fair. I think that, ironically, I think that kind of links to a lot of, especially just because this episode will probably come out definitely in the middle of our network state series, but like kind of Balaji and sort of like this libertarian obsession with the frontier, and like this terra
Oh yeah,
nullius, and the fact
yeah.
that, I mean, that is kind of true. We don't really have that anymore on the earth. We've touched everything now. So we've lost
Yeah.
the ability to be like the novel one to touch something that someone else hasn't touched.
I mean, also like historically, it's a question if this ever existed. Like honestly,
As well.
like
Yeah. Yeah.
did the like it's really hard to like. I mean, when the first like settlers came to like America, I mean, obviously the land was like used by other people. They just like colonized it, and like
Right. Right.
yeah, I don't know. On another notion, I think this term of like nature as like this pristine or this kind of like object which is like not, like if you break it down, it's kind of like it's almost like a landscape or something which is not touched by like capitalism, which is quite like quite like funny or quite like interesting. And like if you look, for example, if you look like in the German forest, like when we first presented this project to people who were in Germany, they were like, oh no, you can't do this to the German forest, no, but like I don't know, like I think 60 to 70%, probably more, of like the German forest is already like lumber production. This is already like wood production. Like when you go into like the forest here, like literally everything is like under the pressure of production, and it's like a mode of production in which like the lumber is taken or the timber is taken from like the forest. And like this idea that there is like this nature or this like untouched space, like even in Europe, is like pretty vague or pretty weird. I mean, there are these like places where you have like nature conservation, and this is true. But these are like, a friend of me like called these like reverse gardens, and that's also pretty true, because they're like spaces where like nature, or where like processes is given like space to, and then they like develop, and maybe this is aesthetic interesting, and also like it gains like biodiversity, but still it's like a conscious decision of someone made the decision to be like, okay, this place is like protected in a sense.
Right. Yeah, it seems that we've come to the point where we don't really have a choice. We have to intentionally create these spaces for this type of growth to happen. And yeah, and if the intention is to try and to optimize, like the particular type of growth, and to allow it to exist for as long as possible and not to fall under the pressures of capitalism, then we need to have some sort of system to do that. Of course, I can imagine some people may argue that, like, oh, well, we've done this in the past already without technology. Why can't we do it like today without technology? Like, do you have any response to that, or do you have any thoughts on, like, I guess the potential side effects or issues with combining nature and technology? And of course, I'm also like, when I ask these questions, I'm like suffering in both what you said just before about like the division with nature, but also like the division with technology. I think I have a very similar view to what you to what you said about nature as well.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, yeah, hard question, sort of. I think, in general, technology can help us as a tool to reorganize society, or reorganize certain things in society. This be like that it can make things more transparent. I mean, specifically like blockchain technology, that it can make things verifiable, that that people can participate like easier in these kind of structures. So if you think of, for example, just maybe in relation to nature, if we would think of like a DAO controlling like a piece of like ecosystem, or like an ecosystem, like a nature preservation park, or like a national park, and like a normal national park, right? Then I would say like the DAO controlling the national park at least have some sort of like participatory moment in it, where people can actually like propose things, or like have sort of like a voice in the system. And also it can have different like models of ownership, in which like the ownership is more like communalized, or more like brought to like a community than, for example, with in German we have a lot of like Stiftungen, which are foundations, which are pretty like unclear who is like sort of like owning them, or like who is sort of in control of them. So I think like in terms of like how we manage access to nature, or we manage sort of also the maintenance, or not the maintenance, but also the flourishing of these places, I think like technology can definitely help.
Yeah. Um, yeah, yeah, there's sometimes, I guess, this like primitivist side who will kind of be adamant that what we need to do is sort of like rely less on technology and intermingle, and like to intermingle these things is like problematic in some way. But I guess, yeah, for me, it's also kind of that type of thinking imposes a very particular image of technology and what technology is. Like, we can anyways like I don't know, like a long time ago, the horse and cart was like the most innovative thing that was created. And but now in today's standards, if you had a horse and cart and you were like, I don't know, tilling the land, people would be like, what are you, a primitivist,
Yeah, I mean, I'm sort of like a big fan of using technology really like specifically for really specific tasks, almost like as a tool thing, but like don't use it for just because you can use it in a
Right.
sense, right? So, like if you look, for example, like at forest management, you have things like satellite image kind of Auswertung is like satellite image. I'm just missing a word which I have in German. It's like when you look at the satellite images and essentially like gather data from
Right.
it. And you can do this, and this is like interesting, and it also has like a purpose. But on the other hand, also like if you look how like a lot of forest is still managed in Germany, it's people walking through the forest and looking at it every 3 months, right? And that's probably almost the same effect, right? So if, I think there can be also like a conscious conscious way in which technology is used in certain things, but in certain things also not, because it's probably sometimes more efficient just to send someone there and look at the trees. Right?
Yeah, old school, old school. Yeah, all right. Thanks so much, Paul, for coming on and sharing with us your experience with Terra0 and what you guys have been doing the past few years, and your thoughts on sort of the connection between land and blockchains and crypto. Maybe to close it out, would you want to share with people where they can keep up with Terra0 and its progress, and maybe with you as well?
Sure. You can keep up with Terra0 mostly on the website, which is terra0.org. You can also visit our Twitter, which is _Terra0. And you can also follow me on Twitter, which is Brachland Berlin as a handle.
Nice. All right. Thanks a lot.
Thank you.